Three. 1, 2, 3. Maybe in the back.
Oh,
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Trent. It's been marvelous. Thank you so much. I guess I wanted to ask, could you say a little bit more about, or maybe I'll ask the question first, and if the question is yeah, there's more to it than answer or not. Is it just that these storefronts were black that made them disorderly? Or was there something else about the specific kind of way that people used them and congregated there that was disorderly beyond the fact that it was just racially heterogeneous or contradictory? Could you say more about that, or about those reasons?
Sure. Can we collect a couple questions and then there was Kingsley and then I'm sorry, what was your name?
Corey.
Great, cool.
We're very cruel to our speakers here. We try to get them to draw lessons for the current moment. Okay. That's it.
Well, I mean, my question was pertaining to, was there like some type of, first and foremost, I wanted to know, was there like some type of sundown town type of effect to like the segregation here in the city? Like you can't go in this community even during the day or something may happen to you, or the night or something. And how severe was it? What was the severity of it throughout time, I guess? And my other question is there some type of dichotomy, a dichotomous type of relationship that you see when you compare and contrast like immigration and housing today, when it comes to even like Hispanic communities who have a similar, struggle story of, being able to attain housing or, moving to certain communities and things of that nature in this day and time, in comparison to back then of African Americans striving to move into, more northern communities and get housing. And I got another question. All right, so I remember when you were saying when white flight happened and the housing asset institutions went with them, they took them with them downtown and to the suburbs. Was there ever a revitalization of those housing assets, in those communities, where the storefronts have like the assets to help them out to own one or own a house or something at that time period?
There's one last one in the back and then we'll let Kai respond.
I also just wanted to say that was badass. Thank you so much. But also just to sort of add on to James' question a little bit. Just like whether like the you talked about the sort of like unorthodox kinds of practices of these churches, like as they existed in the southern rural areas. Did that sort of maintain, like, let's say, itinerant sort of ministers, etc.? Was there any kind of like matriarchal sort of like form that these churches had, or was that a myth that was sort of used to marginalize them? I'm sort of curious, like, more about the context and like how, aside from just being like of the lower classes, like they would be disrupted.
Sure.
Yeah, no, this is great. Let's see. So, in terms of the sundown situation, from what I've heard people say, Chicago was a sundown metropolis in many ways, and a lot of the original formation of a lot of the gangs was in part for protection as these neighborhoods were transitioning. Really the whole history of Chicago, 1919 race riot, of course, it's believed that a certain Mayor Daley may have participated in that because, those kinds of youth organizations were often the conduit into city politics, and so if you were seen as, say, a leader of, say, like a white ethnic, men's club or what have you, that would have been fighting it out on the streets in 1919. That would help get you into Democratic Party circles. In these periods of racial transition, a lot of these battles were being fought. Literally in the streets between people, and the churches had had a complicated relationship to that. Actually, some of the progressive churches that had marched with King were in favor in this was in '64, I believe, became in favor of a curfew for all youth in the city. In order to quell the racial violence that they were often interpreting as say crime or as kind of random, but was also very much connected to these battles over space that this generation that was being born into the period was experiencing, and so yeah, and there's a lot of there was a lot of connection between say the government of Chicago. The Chicago outfit and their attempts to kind of co-opt the emerging gang infrastructure for their own ends. These things are also very much going on at this time, and so yeah, but yeah, there was a lot of territorial racial violence. I've been told, folks at Stateville have told me that they would often there'd be neighborhoods that they would not ride the bus into because it was known that you don't take the bus down there. And so on and so forth. So yeah, in many ways, Chicago was a sundown metropolis. The sundown situation is not just kind of, again, there's often these attempts to kind of pathologize white racism as kind of bigoted individuals who just kind of, if they just kind of could come into society, things would be better. But therefore, sundown towns is kind of manifestation of that in these kind of little nooks and crannies of American life. But no, Chicago was very much an example of the opposite being the case. In terms of the content of the storefront churches, one of the things that's interesting about the storefronts is that the city's opposition to them was so total. There were storefronts that then became more prosperous that were run by Democratic ward committeemen who were very much committed to the daily machine, and yet still. If their ministers did something that the machine didn't like, they could be beaten with clubs, they could be literally run out of the city, even if they were part of the daily machine. And so storefronts were not just attacked because of their kind of ostensible, say, political radicalism or what have you, but part of it is just the way that the storefronts, and this is something that I think is related to the South as well. The storefronts were often just thought of as really weird and funky, as being kind of having kind of very idiosyncratic design, and this was something that was very much traced back to the South. There was a scholar of rural life in Georgia said that rural churches in the South had architecture that was the weirdest in all Christendom. That's and that kind of we're just kind of building. Why would you, But that kind of and that kind of stuff was viewed pathologically as an example of disorganization. But because of the location, that was not thought of, say, in a kind of in a county in Georgia where the cotton economy had been devastated by many different things, and by the 1930s, that was not necessarily thought of as being problematic, especially if it was thought that the theology in those churches was helping to support black labor discipline for different kinds of reasons. Work hard and you will be rewarded in heaven or something like that. But when you have those same kinds of churches in the middle of Chicago, all of a sudden, these weird structures can be thought of as damaging for property values. They can be thought of as and these kinds of religious practices. So, for example, a lot of black pastors got into marriage solicitation, and they would go into City Hall and they would just start basically offering to marry different couples. And the city hated this, and so these ministers would be in some cases literally run down by a CPD and beaten with clubs, and then arrested and end up in jail. And so there was one minister who was in I believe it was in, actually I think they didn't put him into Cook County. I think they actually took him elsewhere. But he was literally battered and bruised in jail. And the Chicago Daily News was celebrating this as running these Negroes out of town, and so then these people, so they were not attacked just for being kind of seemingly directly an exponent of, say, Black liberation theology or something like that. But even just kind of these religious idiosyncrasies that just didn't seem to have a place within the way that the order wanted to organize the city could be subject to very vicious repression in the middle of City Hall, particularly in a certain sense. So in that regard, while, say, the apocalyptic theology was important, I mean, one of the things I'm trying to look at is how the ways that theologies that are not thought of as progressive still call forth this vigorous repression shows how the hostility was not only to what's often thought of as Black radicalism, but really to Black life as such, as something that is not just the American way in a certain kind of sense. And this is one reason why the Moynihan Report and why this whole notion of, say, Black matriarchy and Black pathology was so effective, because it provided a kind of sociological, social scientific rationale, showed that, we're not opposing these people because we hate them, we're opposing them because, we've documented their disorganization, their nonconformity through the generations from slavery, something that endures regardless of the New Deal, of the Great Society, of the Civil Rights Movement, of all these things we tried to do for them. And so those arguments became very effective. And religion was something that was very easy to attack in this regard because of these kind of seemingly outlandish displays of faith, and also because they had so little support from the Black progressives and the white progressives, who did have some level of legitimacy and power in the discussion. Let's see. Oh yeah. So in terms of assets, I mean, I don't really know. I think one of the things about the storefronts that's and I think this is also related to this question of apocalypse, is that, I mean, these places were very ephemeral in a lot of ways. I mean, so much of the religious history has just been literally bulldozed away, and so many of the churches that were prominent in the '60s in opposing the storefronts, that were prominent in opposing Mayor Daley, and trying to link up with the Southern Civil Rights Movement in different ways that the Baptist hierarchy in Chicago didn't like, the Black Baptist hierarchy didn't like, that the Daley regime didn't like. Many of these churches are gone. And many of the buildings that they were in are also gone, and are literally either have been bulldozed or are vacant lots or what have you. So much of that history is vanished, unfortunately. And it's, it's interesting to think about how intentional that could also be as a project. Let's see. In terms of the South, oh yeah, right. So one of the things that's also important here in terms of this notion of disorganization is that, in a sense, this goes really back to the formation of the idea of America as being a country based on religious freedom and the separation of church and state. That's thought of as important because of the compromise, basically the compromise of Protestant denominationalism, the idea that that Protestant denominations will cede to the state all the kind of temporal authority that the state has in exchange for being able to organize themselves religiously as they want, and for the state to just protect their rights as American citizens. But Black people were not part of that compromise, and of course the Constitution enshrines religious freedom and also enshrines slavery, at least for the time being, at that time. Then, during the era of Jim Crow, when the question around how is Protestant denominationalism going to make religious citizenship safe for non-Protestant religious minorities, as that question was being meted out, it was also, again, being done so as primarily a kind of non-Black and ultimately anti-Black idea, because at the same time that this denominationalism is becoming a kind of ecumenical white denominationalism, the government is also supporting segregation. Woodrow Wilson is segregating the federal government in DC, so on and so forth. And in the case of, say, a state like Alabama, they're explicitly arguing that that Black people are actually the enemy of creation, or the enemy of God's providence, are the enemy not only of our way of life, but of life itself. In a very theological way. And so that's one reason why, if you look at, say, Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up From Slavery, the thing that he's most critical of is it's not liberals like Du Bois, it's not liberal arts education, it's actually the call to worship, or excuse me, the call to preach. He thinks that the call to preach is the single biggest impediment to Black progress. The idea that an individual Black person will suddenly be inspired to take up the role of a pastor and form a congregation. He sees this as anathema to Black progress. Du Bois has a more complicated relationship to that because he does very much see the value of apocalypticism and thinks about it a lot, but he also values church organization. And so because of this, in the early discourse around the kind of mainstream Black freedom struggle, if you will, you have this kind of dichotomy set up between attempts to, in a sense, imitate and recreate white Protestant denominationalism as a form of social organization, and these kind of apocalyptic theologies that seem to threaten that attempt. And the call to preach is thought of as one of the key aspects of apocalypticism, the idea that my authority to preach is not because of some organization telling me that I can, it's not because of some credential that I have, it's because I was called by God to do this. And so studies have shown that about 85% of Black churches in the North particularly, were not pastored by pastors with any kind of theological degrees or anything like that. And so because of this, a lot of the churches just were not organized according to the kinds of notions of religious organization that were seen as being authentically religious. And so whatever Black religions then did, it was not thought of as really being religious. And this is one reason why it was so difficult for Black churches to defend themselves with the First Amendment, because there was this idea that that Black people are really not part of, are not really protected under the free exercise of religion, and also that that there's no such thing as Black religious freedom. That Black freedom and religious freedom are not things that have anything to do with each other. And that's why if you look at the opinions, the majority opinions, when courts are ruling against Black churches, they basically never mention race, even if it's utterly clear that that the case was about race. And even if the Black defendants had said that we are being subject to racial discrimination, they often won't even mention race in the opinions. And this is the case. This was the case in Chicago. It was also the case in Atlanta. It was the case in Modesto, California. This was not. This was the case before Brown versus Board of Education and after Brown versus Board of Education. It was not dependent upon any kind of regional or historical factor. This was just something that was taken for granted in American jurisprudence. And so that's kind of a fundamental part of the story. The idea that there's something about Black apocalypticism that is so threatening that it is not something that is protected by the First Amendment. It is not something that comes from organized religion. It's actually the enemy of organized religion and the enemy of organized life itself.
It kind of builds. If it's okay. I see one hand, second hand. I had just to build off of that. I mean, I really appreciate this argument about that. I see the sort of the overall argument, as I understand it, that you're saying that. I mean, integration has historically in this city served as legitimation for suppressing a kind of autonomous community from emerging, autonomous in a variety of levels, spiritually, materially, geographically, and so on. And because I think that like sort of points to like a bigger theme that a number of our discussions have sort of like circled around in different ways, which is that, you know, in some ways we might want to reject the idea that there's a spectrum sort of from left to far left to ultra left concepts of liberation, and rather say that maybe there's just like actually just two fundamentally different orientations. That which, you know, we know as left is and liberal aims to join civil society, right? It wants to internalize and equalize its legitimating frameworks, right? And then there's actually just this really other orientation, which is not just like a farther point on the same spectrum, but really just a different disposition, which is to desert it, to immediately sort of inhabit the kingdom, as the apocalyptic people would sort of say, right? Or in other plain terms, build autonomy and communal life forms now with the conditions they have. In storefronts, I mean, we've literally rented storefronts and tried to do this, right? Like people here, we still do it. So, you know, that's something that I think resonates with a number of us at different levels. And I think one of the things that's like amazing about the way you're drawing this theme out is that like one of the sort of pretenses of this combat against autonomy, right, especially on the side of progressive liberals, was their ability to mobilize an argument against identity politics, saying that it's factional or sectarian or separatist, right? As a way of quashing autonomous self-organization, right? And this way, like what gets buried, I think, why it's so important to recover this sort of history is that, what gets buried today in the sort of critique of identity are all the ways in which there were these efforts to desert visibility altogether. That like that wasn't the point necessarily of an all-black church, right? That it wasn't about being black as opposed to white or black as identitarian within white hegemony, but it was actually just really about a different orientation toward life, truth, the willingness to self-authorize. Like I can state the truth, I can answer the call, I can preach. Right? That ability to just say like I have my own truth. I'm not here to like integrate myself in yours, right? I think that's really powerful, and I think it's helpful for me just to like think about the role of religion in all of this as like a way in which it was able to undermine black people's fascination with white power symbols and why that was so threatening for the city and for the U.S. hegemony more broadly. I don't know if that's overreading the text or
No, I think that's definitely one of the things I've been thinking a lot about. There's a lot of discussions now about the Black radical tradition and whatnot, which is a lot of stuff is really great. I think it is important though to pay attention to just very small scale practices that don't necessarily read necessarily as being part of the Black radical tradition per se, but speak to a certain kind of critique of the kind of normative way of things in other kinds of ways. And actually, I think in one of the more recent editions of Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson does mention Pentecostal churches as being potentially an example of Black radical tradition. So that's one side of that. And yeah, I think also to that point, one of the things that's interesting about this is that the churches that were attacked were not the large churches. It was the small churches. This was a 35-member church that was facing all this opposition. It was not that they were bringing in thousands of black people or something like that. It was a very small church, and those were the churches that faced the most opposition. Yeah.
So there's a hand there and then another hand here.
Yeah, I want to continue down some of the things that you were just speaking on that Adrian kind of brought up, particularly with the compare and contrast with some of the other religious, unique Chicago experimental sort of things, religious and cult, as well. El Rukin, Temple Number 9, mentioned Nation of Islam as like unique Chicago type things. And what would you see, because it seems like you're painting a picture of St. James and all these small churches as being distinct along Protestant Baptist lines, as being separate from the rest of the country in the same way that a Nation of Islam might be separate from the rest of, or Moorish ideology is like separate from, how it was going in the rest of the country or the rest of the world. What's the type of thing that you would hear rhetoric-wise or spiritually about at these churches? I know you said there's some limited information we have about them, but like, what would you hear, being preached by any number of these preachers if you went to a St. James mass or what have you, Sunday?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't really know often, and I'm sometimes still kind of researching at this point. I will say though that, a couple of things. One is that, I've often thought of this project as being about Black Protestants for various